My name is Robert Singleton. I'm the Director of Policy and Public Affairs for California and the West region for Chamber of Progress. We're a tech industry association supporting public policies to build a more inclusive country in which all people benefit from technological leaps. I have some prepared remarks about just the general approach and some concerns we have with the ADMT regulations, but going off the cuff here a little bit and using some of the examples that we saw by staff, I'm really concerned about how this affects consumers and how they're treated in aggregate. In particular, as it comes to, are businesses going to be allowed to incentivize either opting out or non-opting out? So what I mean by this is, if I don't opt in to having my personal information used to hopefully improve my user experience using an app or something like that, and let's say the business provides incentives for opting in or for using my data, so specialized offers, discounts, things like that nature, is the fact that I, who opted out, did not receive access to these benefits or offers or other potential things, is that inherently retaliatory towards me as the one opting out? It's an interesting question, because if the answer is yes, then are we explicitly not allowing for incentives for participating in trading information and data, essentially for discounts, preferred customers, you know, some real use cases here, especially if you fly a lot like I do every week. Having access to Bing frequent flyer miles and other programs are a real boon. But if we are saying that those can be allowed, and if I do opt out and that's non-retaliatory, does that mean that we're inherently codifying a preferred track for consumers, so that there's going to be a group of consumers who unilaterally opt into things and then massively benefit across every single business or application or marketplace they participate in by being a preferred consumer, the ones willing to share their data, whereas those who are not willing to share their data for very legitimate privacy concerns, intellectual property, artist style, things like that, are now relegated to being not preferred consumers across many different apps, marketplaces, and settings. So it's a big concern that I have just personally in looking at the process, and I think it's not really addressed in the regulations I've seen thus far, and so really answering that question of what is retaliatory in terms of businesses being able to offer things that I think would be beneficial to consumers in their experience. I also worry generally about training data and AI, and what's already been used to train existing models. What are we going back to retroactive data privacy in terms of everything that I've ever put into a Google search engine that could be attributed to me? If we're looking at app stores in particular, I don't know if you guys looked at it, but OpenAI made a big product announcement this week, as did Google with their entire Gemini 1.5. I was at the Google I/O conference yesterday. They're now designing every single Google device, every single Google application, all their sub-applications, all the developers are all going to be based upon Gemini, their core AI engine, their core frontier model built into everything they do. So to what extent does Google have an onus to provide opt-out? Their app developers have an onus to do this. Different device people who publish things, people who sell right-to-repair kits, who are utilizing personal information. How this manifests the digital marketplace could be potentially very problematic when we're going rapidly towards a place where AI is going to be on every single device and a part of every single consequential decision that we make in the economy, just as consumers. That's where we're headed. And so this, could be quite a lot of layers of compliance for a business. Maybe it's easier for Google to do, but for two people working on an application in their garage, trying to make it big in a startup, having to have what essentially could be a compliance attorney and an auditor and having to submit all these things could be pretty impactful to their business and their ability to survive and thrive. As an example, I'll say I used to work for a carbon accounting startup where we helped businesses and cities and governments reduce their carbon footprint by taking in a lot of data, making recommendations about building footprint, about employee travel habits, about parking, I mean, all these things. And if we didn't have access, or if someone could opt out preferably, or if we were doing a business park and there was individual vendors there that each had different employees or different consumer markets, not having access to that data would certainly not be able for us to provide our core business offering. But at the same time, where's the balance between the individual folks who would ultimately benefit from reducing carbon footprint there? So I'm here today to urge you to revise your approach and set aside your well-intentioned but ultimately problematic proposal to regulate automated decision-making tools in lieu of the ongoing legislation and executive action relating to artificial intelligence, which the rulemaking process stands to potentially undermine. The proposed rules, impact assessment, and safeguard requirements are excessive and potentially harm competition. They expose business strategy and stifle competition by mandating that businesses disclose the details of their automated decision tools to the public. So, for instance, an app developer. Any such disclosure of sensitive business practices must serve a compelling government interest and be narrowly tailored. The draft rules come up a little bit short on both. This is doubly pragmatic because automated decision tools are essential for online platforms, enhancing user experience through recommendations on products and services and fostering innovation. While redacting trade secrets may offer some protection, the proposed rules regulations, extensive requirements risk handling proprietary strategies to competitors, giving them valuable insights that would undermine competition and ultimately harm consumers. The CPPA's approach creates confusion over who is charged with protecting some Californians. Again, in the instance of online marketplaces and understanding the onus of liability and disclosure requirements in between platforms and the marketplaces and the folks who curate those marketplaces. Many of the proposed provisions are quite similar to policy being considered in the state legislature presently. So if the CPPA and the state legislature are both act, it will create sometimes redundant or concerningly overlapping policies, leaving developers unclear as to who is regulating them and the public unclear on who is protecting them. It is also possible that any rules propagated by the CPPA would quickly be obviated by the legislature. The CPPA should pause at least until the people's elected representatives have had a chance to opine through at least the end of this session's term. In September 2023, Governor Newsom published his executive order, which called for a whole-of-government approach to AI policy. Indeed, the executive order took pains to balance innovation and consumer protection, as discussed below. In contrast, the CPPA's automated decision-making tools proceedings stand to duplicate much of the work of this administration, once again creating confusion for developers and the public alike. Policy can protect consumers without squandering California's tech leadership. We commend the CPPA for considering the potential harm for automated decision-making. The current proposal adds substantial regulatory and compliance burdens to California startups without obviously advancing consumer privacy. For example, the proposal mandates software developers create a mechanism to offer consumers the ability to opt out of hotel or flight upgrades, preferred track for customers, and few, if any, customers would ever want that. Nevertheless, the rules as drafted would obligate every small hotelier to develop that functionality. A better approach would be to work with stakeholders to identify areas where drafting can be improved and tailor the rules narrowly to advance consumer protections in those key sectors. On the notion of AI training data, since I still have some time, this is a really hard one in terms of being able to tie inputs of training data towards outputs, not necessarily with Gen AI, but with any kind of automated decision tool. Many of the most sophisticated frontier models are ingesting billions upon billions of data input streams and optimizing those oftentimes without any human supervision or knowledge of the inner workings in every single billionth iteration of which data point is being used and correlated to what. And so it's oftentimes really hard to take inputs and clearly understand how they were articulated, processed, and then utilized to render a series of given inputs. And it can be really hard and technically difficult. So not only just legally, but technically difficult to try and figure that out. And for a brand new agency to try and bite off that apple, what is largely going to be somewhat of a transcendental economic technology that's going to be a part of every part of our lives, every device that we have here, it's a difficult regulatory task, especially to try and lure away the folks who actually have the technical capacity to be able to weigh in these in a sophisticated and competent manner. Your average AI developer right now is making at least $350,000 a year in base salary, probably upwards towards $1 million if they're really good. So being able to lure that talent from the private sector to be able to trace back how the inputs and outputs align and where the disclosure and the onus on which part of that chain, whether it's a frontier model or maybe a kernel you downloaded and personalized or fine-tuned and trained as a developer that you apply to a specific use case. And then my biggest worry is that this may perpetuate biases because you have a large group of people who do opt out of being part of the training data, and then the outputs are inherent towards those who opted in versus those opting out, creating what could be codified bias in, again, people's economic and consumer experience.